The day Adaeze buried her husband, she also buried a lie that had been living inside her home for 11 years. She stood at the graveside in Enugu, dressed in white because that is what Igbo widows wear. White, the color of mourning, the color of questions. The harmattan wind pulled at the hem of her wrapper, and she held her 2 children close, one on each side, the way a woman holds the only things left that are truly hers. The priest was speaking. The women around her were crying. Someone was beating a small drum somewhere in the distance. And then, from across the open grave, she saw them. A woman she had never seen before in her life, standing with the posture of someone who had every right to be there. And beside her, 2 children, a boy and a girl. The boy she noticed first because he had Emeka's jaw. Emeka's exact jaw. The same sharp line, the same slight tilt to the left when he stood still. She had kissed that jaw 1,000 times. She knew that jaw the way she knew her own name. The stranger across the grave caught Adaeze's eyes, and she did not look away. That was the moment the ground beneath Adaeze's feet became something other than ground. She had met Emeka Okafor in 1998 at a trade fair in Onitsha. She was 23, selling fabric for her mother's shop, and he was 26, loud and generous, the kind of man who laughed with his whole chest. He bought 6 yards of Ankara from her that afternoon. He came back the next day and bought 6 more. On the 3rd day, he came back with nothing to buy, just him, his wide smile, and a bottle of Fanta he pressed into her hand like it was something precious. "I don't need more fabric," he told her. "I need you to agree to see me." She laughed at him. She told him he was too forward. She told him she would think about it. She thought about it for exactly 4 days, and then she said yes. By 2000, they were married. By 2002, they had their first child, a daughter named Chidimma. By 2004 came their son, Tobena. They lived in Enugu in a solid 3-bedroom house with a garden that Adaeze kept herself. Emeka ran an import business, electronics mostly, things that came in from China and went out to retailers across the southeast. It meant he traveled. It always meant he traveled. She never thought anything of it. He would go to Lagos, he said, for supplier meetings. He went 4, sometimes 5 times a year. He always came back with gifts, wrappers for her, toys for the children, sometimes a bottle of something expensive for himself that he would share with her on a Friday night. He called her every day when he was away, every single day. He said, "I love you," the way a man says it when he means it, not the way a man says it when he is hiding something, or at least that is what she believed. He died in February on a Tuesday. Heart attack, 48 years old. He was in Lagos when it happened, and the hospital called her at 4 a.m. She packed her bag while her legs were still shaking, left the children with her sister-in-law, and drove through the night. He was already gone by the time she arrived. She sat beside his body for a long time, holding his hand, which had already gone cold, and she spoke to him quietly, the way you speak to someone when you are not sure whether they can still hear you. She said, "Emeka, why did you not tell me you were sick?" She did not know yet that there were other questions she should have been asking. They brought him home to Enugu for the burial, as was right. The family gathered. His brothers came, his cousins, his mother who was 71 and wept in a way that broke something in Adaeze just to watch. The church was full. Emeka had been well liked. He was the kind of man people remembered because he made you feel seen. He asked questions about your life and then actually listened to the answers. The kind of man who at a burial would have been the first one making sure everyone had food and enough chairs. The burial rites took 3 days as tradition required. And on the 2nd day, when they gathered at the graveside for the lowering of the casket, Adaeze saw the woman. She could not have been older than 35. She was wearing white too, because she was in mourning too, and that detail landed in Adaeze's chest like a stone dropped into still water. The woman had a composed face, not hard, not aggressive, composed, like someone who had prepared herself for exactly this moment and decided in advance how she would carry it. The 2 children beside her were maybe 8 and 10 years old. the boy with Emeka's jaw, the girl with Emeka's ears. Adaeze looked at those children and her stomach turned to water. Her eldest brother, Chukwuemeka, appeared at her elbow. He had seen her face change. He said quietly, "Nne, are you feeling well?" She said nothing. She watched as the strange woman kept her eyes forward, dignified, unflinching, while the casket was lowered. She watched as the woman's children cried, the boy trying to be stoic, the girl letting the tears come freely. She watched as a man, one of Emeka's cousins, she realized, a cousin she had known for years, walked over to the woman after the casket was down and put a hand briefly on her shoulder. A hand of comfort, a hand that said, "We know you," a hand that said, "You belong here too." The world is built of small gestures that reveal everything. After the graveside, during the gathering at the family compound, Adaeze found the cousin. His name was Ikenna. He was 3 years older than Emeka and had always been quieter than the rest of the family, a watchful man who chose his words the way someone choosing between knives chooses, carefully, with purpose. She pulled him aside, behind the row of chairs where the women were serving food. She asked him who the woman was. Ikenna did not lie to her. She respected that later, when she had more room to feel things beyond the first crushing wave. He did not look away, did not shuffle his feet, did not give her a half answer designed to protect himself. He looked at her directly, and he said, "Her name is Ngozi. She lives in Lagos. She and Emeka have been together for 11 years. 11 years. Adaeze did not scream. She did not fall. She stood exactly where she was, behind the row of chairs with the sound of mourning all around her, and she breathed, in and out, slowly, the way her mother had taught her to breathe when her father died, when she was 16. Breathe first, fall apart later. Breathe first, fall apart later. She said, "The children." Ikenna nodded. She said, "How many?" He said, "2. The boy is 10, the girl is 8. So while Tobena was being born, while Adaeze was in the labor ward, gripping the steel rails of the hospital bed, pushing her son into the world, Emeka had a woman in Lagos who was also pregnant with his child. She went back to the gathering. She sat in her chair. She accepted condolences. She held her face together with both hands, not literally, but that is what it felt like she had to physically hold her face together or it would come apart and people would see everything underneath. She watched Ngozi across the compound, sitting quietly with her children, receiving her own quiet stream of sympathizers. Emeka's people from the Lagos side of his life, people Adaeze had never met, people who knew a version of Emeka she did not know existed. She watched and she catalogued. This is a thing Adaeze had always done, even as a little girl. When something confused or frightened her, she watched. She filed information away. She processed later. That night, after the compound emptied and the children were asleep, she sat alone in the room she had shared with Emeka for 19 years and she opened his phone. She had the password. She had always had the password. He had given it to her freely, years ago, and she had never had reason to use it. She opened it now. What she found was a second life. The photographs were there, not hidden, not deleted, simply organized, the way a man organizes things when he believes he will never be caught. A folder of photographs, Ngozi at a birthday dinner, Ngozi at the beach in Calabar, the boy on his first day of school, the girl at her dance recital, and Emeka in these photographs. Emeka laughing with that full-chested laugh, Emeka holding the boy on his shoulders, Emeka with his arm around Ngozi the way he used to put his arm around Adaeze when they were young, and the world had not yet shown them what it could do to people. Messages, thousands of them. She did not read them all. She could not. She read enough to understand the shape of it, the tenderness, the planning, the way he moved between these two lives with the precision of a man who had built the architecture carefully over years, who had become expert at maintaining two separate structures that never touched, never overlapped, never let one woman's world bump against the other woman's world. He called Ngozi every evening. He called Adaeze every morning. She realized this immediately when she checked the call logs. He had divided them by time of day. Morning belonged to Adaeze, evening belonged to Ngozi. And she thought about all those morning calls, all those calls when he asked about the children and told her he missed her jollof rice and said he would be home by Friday. She thought about how she had believed those calls completely, had pressed the phone against her ear and felt the warmth of them, had told her friends, "My husband is not like other men. He calls me every day when he is away." She put the phone down. She sat in the room for a long time. Then she started to cry, and once she started, she could not stop for a very long time. She cried the way women cry when they are alone and there is no one to be strong for, no one watching, no composure required. She cried with her whole body. She cried for the marriage she thought she had. She cried for the 19 years she had given to this man with all of herself, holding nothing back. She cried for her children, who had a father who loved them, she had no doubt of that, who had a father who also had other children they did not know about. She cried for the version of Emeka she loved, the Emeka who bought 6 yards of fabric and then came back because he wanted her. She cried for him because she had to mourn him separately, that man, that original man, and she was not even sure how much of him was real. And then, somewhere in the very deep part of that night, she stopped crying and she got angry. It was a cold anger, not hot, not screaming, cold and clear and sharp-edged, the kind of anger that arrives when grief has burned through all the softer layers and reaches something harder underneath. She had given this man her entire adult life. She had built her world around him. She had turned down opportunities, made sacrifices, structured herself around the demands of being his wife and the mother of his children. And he had been living in Lagos with another woman, fathering other children, building another house, dividing his love and his money and his time between 2 families. And he had never, once, not once in 11 years, thought she deserved the truth. She thought about Ngozi. This is the thing that surprised her later when she talked about it to a therapist. She was surprised by how quickly she moved from anger at Ngozi to something more complicated. Because the more she thought about it, the more she understood that Ngozi was not the enemy. Ngozi was another woman in a house built on lies. The question was whether Ngozi knew about Adaeze. That question had to be answered. She found out 3 days after the burial, when her brother-in-law, Obioro, Emeka's younger brother, the one who had always been a little more honest than the rest of them, sat with her on the veranda and told her what he knew. He had known about Ngozi for 6 years. He had warned Emeka twice. He had not told Adaeze because, he said, his hands were shaking as he said it, because Emeka had begged him not to, and because he believed, or he had told himself, that it would destroy the family. She asked about Ngozi. She asked whether Ngozi knew about her. Obioro said yes. Yes. Ngozi had known about Adaeze from the beginning, from the very beginning, before she agreed to be with Emeka. He had told her about his wife in Enugu. He had told Ngozi that the marriage was loveless, that he and Adaeze were together only for the children, that he would leave eventually when the time was right. He had told Ngozi that she was the woman he truly chose. And he had told Adaeze all those years that she was the woman he truly chose. He gave each of them the same lie and called it love. Adaeze sat with that for a moment. The wind moved through the compound. A lizard crossed the veranda and disappeared into the bougainvillea. She said to Obioro, very quietly, "I want to speak with her." Obioro looked alarmed. He started to say something about waiting, about time, about it not being the moment, and she held up her hand and stopped him.
"I will speak with her," she said again. "Not now, when I am ready, but I will speak with her." She was not ready for 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, she operated on a kind of controlled numbness. She fed the children, she took Chidima and Toberna to school, she handled the condolence visits, of which there were many because Emeka had been well liked and people were generous with their grief and their food and their company. She met with his business associates because there were practical matters, the import business, the accounts, the contracts. She found out during this process that the business had been funding both households, that Lagos had its own apartment, its own school fees, its own monthly upkeep, that Emeka had been running the financial architecture with as much care as the emotional one. She felt a fury about the money that was different from the fury about the betrayal, sharper somehow, because the money was concrete. She could look at figures on a page. She could see the Lagos apartment rental coming out of the business account. She could see the tuition fees for children whose names she was still learning. These were not feelings, these were numbers, and numbers, unlike feelings, do not lie. She gathered all of it, every document, every statement, every record. She had always been the one who managed the household accounts, and he had trusted her with that. Another irony she could taste at the back of her throat. She knew where everything was. She found things he had probably assumed were hidden well enough. She put it all in order. Then she called Ngozi. The phone rang twice. Ngozi picked up. Her voice was careful. Not cold, not warm, just careful. She said, "I wondered when you would call." Adaeze said, "I would like to meet you." Silence. Then Ngozi said, "Where?" She had expected resistance. She had prepared for it. She was mildly surprised to find there was none. They met in Asaba, a midpoint between Enugu and Lagos, which had been agreed upon with the neutrality of a peace negotiation, which in some ways it was. Adaeze drove herself. She did not bring anyone, did not want witnesses or support, or the pressure of performing composure for someone she loved. She arrived first, found a corner table in a quiet restaurant, ordered groundnut soup and fufu she did not intend to eat, and waited. Ngozi walked in, and Adaeze looked at her properly for the first time, not across a grave, not at a distance, but up close. She was a tall woman, fine-featured, with the kind of face that was probably striking when she was younger and had only become more so with age. She was dressed simply. She looked, Adaeze thought, exhausted. Not the exhaustion of travel, but the deeper kind, the exhaustion of years of something. She sat down across from Adaeze, and for a moment neither of them spoke. It was Ngozi who broke the silence. She said, "I am sorry." Adaeze looked at her. She said, "For which part?" Ngozi said, "For knowing and not stopping, for believing what he told me about you, for all of it." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "He lied to both of us. He told me you were strangers to each other. He told me he was only there for the children. I believed him for a long time, and then I stopped believing him, and I told myself it did not matter because I had my children and my life and—" She stopped. "That was cowardice. I am sorry." Adaeze studied her. She had come to this meeting expecting to feel rage, the cold, clear-edged rage of those 2 weeks. She found something more complicated. She found grief, and underneath the grief, recognition. She recognized a woman who had also been lied to, who had also been used as material in the construction of someone else's comfort, who had also given years to a man who had divided himself and given each of them only half. She said, "Did you love him?" Ngozi said, quietly, "Yes." Adaeze said, "Then we are both fools." And Ngozi, to her own visible surprise, let out a sound that was almost a laugh. Not happy, something else. The sound of two people recognizing each other in wreckage. They talked for 2 hours. Not warmly, not easily, but honestly. With the honesty of women who have nothing left to protect, no version of events left to maintain, no more story to keep intact. Ngozi told her things about Emeka, things he had said, decisions he had made, the ways he had managed her, and Adaeze recognized the patterns. The same tricks worked on her, the same phrases. He had a method. She could see the method now, laid out between them like a blueprint. Ngozi told her that she had asked him many times over the years to leave Adaeze, that he had always refused, that his reasons shifted, the children, the family, the culture, her mother, the business, always something, always a reason that put the decision just slightly beyond the present moment, always a promise that it would happen eventually, just not yet, just not now. She had waited 11 years for a now that never came. Adaeze said, "He told me he loved me every day." Ngozi said, "He told me the same." They looked at each other across the soup neither of them had touched. Adaeze said, "What will you do now?" Ngozi said, "I don't know. My children have lost their father. I have to think of them first. She paused. What will you do? Adaeze said, the same. There was a moment, quiet, strange, the two of them sitting with the knowledge of what they shared. The grief, the children, the man who had made both of them halves of a truth. Then Adaeze reached into her bag and placed a folder on the table. She said, there is the matter of the estate. Ngozi looked at the folder and then at Adaeze. Adaeze said, his business, his accounts. There are 4 children between us. I am not here to fight you, and I am not going to pretend those children do not exist. They exist. They are Emeka's children, and that is not their fault. I need you to understand that whatever I do next, it is not about punishing your children. Ngozi said nothing for a moment. Then she said, what are you proposing? Adaeze said, I am proposing that we handle this properly, legally, without warfare. The business assets go through proper channels. The accounts are declared fully. The children, all 4 of them, are recognized. I will not pretend I don't have feelings about this. I do, but I will not let those feelings punish children. Ngozi looked at her for a long time. She said, he said you were cold. He said you were difficult. He said the marriage had no warmth. Adaeze said, he needed you to believe that. Ngozi said, I know that now. Adaeze drove back to Enugu that evening. The road was long and the night came down thick and dark around her car, and she drove through it with both hands on the wheel, very steady, very deliberate. She turned the radio off after 20 minutes because the music was either too sad or too cheerful, and she could not bear either. She drove in silence. She thought about the 19 years. She sorted through them the way you go through a house that has to be packed up, room by room, object by object, deciding what to keep, what to discard, what was worth something and what only looked like it was. The early years, before she knew anything, those she kept. The joy in them was real, even if the man was not entirely what she thought. The children were real. The times she had laughed until she could not breathe, those were real. She would not give those up. She would not allow the lie to reach back through time and retroactively hollow out everything. But she would also not pretend. She had a friend, Uju, who had been widowed 5 years before under less complicated circumstances. And Uju had told her at the time, sitting at Adaeze's kitchen table, drinking tea, her eyes red, she had told her, the hardest thing is not losing the person. The hardest thing is being in a grief that no one quite understands because they see the loss but they cannot see everything you actually lost, all the private things that only the 2 of you knew. Adaeze understood that now in dimensions Uju had not been speaking about because she was grieving 2 things at once, the husband who had died and the husband she had believed she had who had never existed. Both losses were real. Both were hers to carry, and there was no name for that specific kind of grief, no ritual for it, no communal understanding that could fully hold it. She was in new territory. She told her children the truth gradually, carefully, with the guidance of the therapist she started seeing 6 weeks after the burial. The therapist was a woman named Dr. Obi, who walked out of a quiet office in GRA, and who had a stillness about her that Adaeze found oddly comforting. Not warmth exactly, but groundedness, the sense of someone who had heard difficult things before and had not been destroyed by them. Chidinma was 17. She received the truth with a kind of stunned, furious quiet that reminded Adaeze painfully of herself. She did not cry immediately. She sat with it, and then she went to her room, and Adaeze heard music coming from underneath the door, very loud for about 2 hours, and then silence. And then Chidinma came out and said, "Are we going to be okay financially?" And Adaeze said, "Yes." And Chidinma nodded and said, "Okay," and went to heat up the food from the pot. That was how Chidinma processed pain, by immediately turning to the practical. Adaeze recognized this because it was her own mechanism, the thing she had passed down without meaning to. Tobenna was 15. He cried, which surprised her a little, not because he was a boy and therefore expected not to. Adaeze had never subscribed to that foolishness, but because Tobenna had always been the one who laughed the most in the house, the one who diffused tension with jokes, and to see him without that was disorienting. He cried, and then he asked questions, many questions, rapid fire, the kind that did not always wait for answers. He asked why, he asked how long, he asked whether Papa had loved them less because of this. He asked whether the other children knew about them. Adaeze answered every question she could answer. For the ones she could not, she said, "I don't know, and I think that's all right." The question about whether Papa had loved them less was the one she sat with longest. She said, finally, "I believe he loved you completely." That is the hardest thing about this, that love can be completely real and still exist alongside choices that are wrong. Your father loved you. He also made choices that were wrong and that hurt people. Both of those things are true at the same time. Tobenna said, "That doesn't make sense." She said, "I know. People are like that sometimes. It takes a long time to make peace with it." He asked her, weeks later, whether he could meet his half-siblings. She had expected this question and had also been dreading it. She said she would think about it. She did think about it, carefully, with Dr. Obi, turning it over from every angle. She came down on the side of yes, because those children were not guilty of anything, and because Tobenna had a right to his own relationships, and because her own pain was not a wall she had the right to build around her children. The first meeting was arranged through a mutual intermediary, Obiora, who had admitted his knowledge and was making quiet amends by making himself useful. It happened in a park in Asaba, that same neutral city, and Adaeze and Ngozi sat on a bench while their 4 children met each other on the grass in front of them, the way children meet, warily at first, and then with the particular speed of the young, not warily at all. The 2 women watched their children and did not speak for a while. Ngozi said eventually, "This is strange." Adaeze said, "Everything about this is strange." Ngozi said, "I thought you would hate me." Adaeze said, "I tried." A pause. It didn't hold. Ngozi was quiet. Then she said, "He told me you were strong. He said it sometimes like a complaint, but I think he was in awe of you. I think he was afraid of you." Adaeze said he should have trusted me instead. Ngozi said, "Yes." The practical matters took almost 8 months to resolve. There were lawyers involved and accountants, and one very unpleasant meeting with Emeka's eldest brother, who arrived with opinions about what the women were and were not entitled to, and left that meeting with a clear understanding that Adaeze was not a woman who responded to opinions with gratitude. She had arranged her position carefully. She had documentation, she had rights, she had intelligence and composure, and the cold, bright anger that she had learned to use like a tool rather than let it use her. The estate was settled fairly. All 4 children were recognized. The business assets were divided with appropriate legal consideration. Adaeze kept the house in Enugu, which had always been hers more than his anyway. She had decorated it, maintained it, grown things in its garden. She kept that garden. She found during those dark months that the garden was one of the things that held her. The simple biological stubbornness of plants, the way they grew toward light regardless, the way they came back after you thought the dry season had finished them. She started writing things down, not a diary exactly, more like a record. Things she needed to say somewhere that was not inside her own head, where everything bounced around and got tangled. She wrote about Emeka. She wrote the good things and she wrote the bad things, and she found that both could exist on the same page without destroying each other, which was something. She wrote about what it meant to love someone fully and then discovered the love was built on a floor with a secret trapdoor. She wrote about whether that made the love false, and she concluded, after many drafts, many revisions, that it did not. The love was hers. He had not been able to manufacture her feelings from the outside. The love came from her, and it was real, and his deceptions did not have the power to reach inside her and retroactively hollow it out. The love was real. His honesty was not. These were separate things. She wrote about Ngozi too. The complexity of that, of a woman she had every reason to disdain becoming instead someone she understood. Not a friend exactly, not yet, Something else. Two people who shared a catastrophe, who were shaped by the same event, although from different angles, and who were now navigating the aftermath in adjacent spaces without quite colliding. 18 months after the burial, Chidimma started university. She chose law. Adaeze drove her to campus and helped her settle into her dormitory, and on the drive back, alone in the car on the familiar road, she found herself laughing. Not bitterly, just laughing, a real laugh that surprised her because she had suddenly thought of something small and funny Chidimma had said during the unpacking, something about the size of the dormitory bathroom, and the laugh just came. Uncomplicated, present. She took note of it. She filed it carefully. Things were moving. The women in Adaeze's mother's age grade had a phrase for what Adaeze was doing, though she learned it later from her mother herself, who said it to her on the phone one evening while Adaeze was sitting in the garden. Igbambo. It means roughly to rebuild, to put oneself back together. Not the same as before. You are not reassembling a broken thing into its original shape. You are doing something else, something that does not have a single word in English but Igbo seems to understand. Making a new thing from the pieces of the old one. Becoming yourself again, but changed, but still yourself. Her mother said, "You are doing Igbambo. I can hear it in your voice." Adaeze said, "I don't feel like I am." Her mother said, "That is how you know it is working. If you felt it, it would not be real. The real ones happen underneath and you only notice them later." She thought about that for a long time. She thought about what she had believed about her marriage and what the marriage had actually been, and the gap between those two things. She thought about how she had structured her sense of self around a story that turned out to be incomplete. And she thought about what it meant to have to rebuild a sense of self on a foundation that had been disrupted at its core. The therapist said something useful about this around the time Adaeze had been seeing her for almost a year. She said, "You gave Emeka a great deal of authority over your reality, not consciously, but in the way marriages work, in the way love works, you allowed his version of things to shape your own. Part of what you are doing now is reclaiming authority over your own reality. You are deciding what was true and what was not, and that decision belongs to you now. It doesn't belong to him anymore." Adaeze sat with that. She went home and she sat in the garden for a long time and she thought about authority, about how she had handed it over freely, willingly, the way women are trained to. How she had arranged herself around a man's narrative without ever fully understanding that she was doing so. And she thought about how even in the grief and the fury and the humiliation, there was something underneath all of it that was hers alone. A self that had existed before Emeka and that had continued to exist inside the marriage even when she was not paying attention to it. A self that was still there now. That self had raised 2 excellent children. That self had managed a household and finances with precision. That self had walked into a meeting with a strange woman across a grave and handled it with dignity. That self had sat in a lawyer's office with her documentation in order and had not allowed itself to be diminished. That self had driven through the night to retrieve a dead husband and had held its shape. She was not who she had been, but she was still herself, more herself maybe. The pretenses had all burned away. There was nothing left to perform. What remained was actual. 2 years after the burial, she started a small fabric business. It began as something to do with her hands, her mother's old fabric contacts, a few fabric samples she had kept for sentiment. It grew quickly because she had an eye and she had discipline, and she had the particular credibility of a woman who had been through something and come out of it without becoming brittle. Customers found her. Word spread. By the 3rd year, she had a small shop in Enugu's New Market and then a second. She had not planned for any of it. She had planned very little of anything in those 2 years. She had simply moved forward, one decision at a time, keeping her face toward the light, the way plants do. She ran into Ngozi once, by coincidence, in a hotel lobby in Abuja. They were both there for separate purposes. Adaeze for a trade conference, Ngozi for something she mentioned briefly and Adaeze did not ask about. They sat in the lobby and had coffee, and it was easier this time. Not easy, easier. They talked about the children. Ngozi's son had started secondary school. Tobena had passed his JAMB exam. Chidima had joined the debate club at university and was apparently feared. They talked about Emeka once, briefly, near the end of the coffee. Ngozi said, "I used to be angry at him every day. I would wake up angry." Adaeze said, "And now?" Ngozi said, "Now I just feel sorry for him sometimes. Sorry that he thought he had to do it that way, that he could not find a better way to be." Adaeze thought about this. She said, "I am not sorry for him yet." Ngozi said, "No, that takes longer." Adaeze said, "Maybe never." Ngozi said, "Maybe." They parted in the lobby with something that was almost warmth, the warmth of shared wreckage that has been sorted through and is no longer smoking. They did not embrace, they did not plan to meet again, but neither of them left the lobby quickly. They walked their separate ways slowly, and Adaeze noticed as she went that she felt not healed, not whole, but level, steady, like ground that has been through an earthquake and is for now not moving. She wrote about it that night in her notebook, the record she had been keeping. She wrote, "I used to think that being strong meant not being destroyed, but I was destroyed. I was completely taken apart, and I found out that even after you are taken apart, something keeps standing. Something does not fall. I don't have a word for that thing, but it was there the whole time, and I never knew it was mine." She closed the notebook. She looked out the window of the Abuja hotel at the city lights. She thought about the girl she had been at 23, selling fabric at a trade fair in Onitsha, and the woman who had arrived at this window. She thought about everything between those 2 points. The love, which was real. The marriage, which was complicated. The grief, which was real. The anger, which was real. The rebuilding, which was ongoing. The children, who were excellent. The garden in Enugu, which was growing. She thought about Emeka, who had loved her and lied to her and was gone now, and who she had carried in different ways through every stage of these 2 years, as a husband, as a ghost, as a lie, as a man she had known imperfectly, as the father of her children, as a warning, as a question she was still answering. She thought, "I gave him my best years." And then she thought, "No, wait, those were my years. I gave them to a marriage and I lived them fully and they were mine. He was in them, but they were mine." She turned away from the window. She ordered room service, pounded yam and egusi soup, because she was hungry and because she deserved a real meal and because life, even the wrecked and rebuilt kind, insists on going forward and demanding to be fed. She ate slowly at the little desk by the window, looking at her notebook, looking at the city. She thought Chidima is going to be a formidable woman. She thought Tobena is going to be fine. She thought the second shop needs a new display rack. She thought, "I want to go to the coast this year. I have not been to the sea in too long." She thought all of these things in the same 15 minutes, naturally, without effort, the way a mind moves when it has room again to move, when it is no longer closed down around a single wound, guarding it, suckling it, unable to look anywhere else. She finished her food. She washed her hands. She went to bed and slept for the first time in a long time without dreaming of him.